Let's talk about protection. I'm talking about LLCs, of course, and in this video I'm going to go over my exact LLC structure that I use for investing. I actually have a few LLCs at this point, and I'll explain my rationale for why I'm using them. But first, what is an LLC? It's a limited liability company, and it is a separate legal entity that can own and do things by itself. Legally speaking, of course. On paper, it's separate from you as a person and has its own debts, its own assets, and it's all within its own entity. To open an LLC, you'll have to file in whatever state that you want that LLC to be in. Typically you need to have some sort of presence there, like an address, and you'll often need a registered agent, which is basically someone present in the state who can get a notice of a lawsuit or something like that. The state wants to make sure that you can be reached within the state, even if you're largely operating outside of it. Whatever the case, you make your filing, you pay your fees, and you got an LLC pretty quickly after that in most cases. It's very simple to do, and just about anyone can open one up, especially with the help of many of the online filing services out there. But why use an LLC at all? Right now it just sounds like a hassle, but there are some advantages to using an LLC. First off, it's in the name, limited liability. That means that the owners or the members of this LLC, technically speaking, they are not liable for what the business does. Instead, the business itself is liable, but the members who actually own that business are not liable for the business's debts, at least directly. Same goes for any legal claims. A legal claim against the business will just apply to that business and won't necessarily apply to the actual owners. That is the limited liability part of the limited liability company. Of course, there are ways for people to, quote, pierce the veil, which is where they can actually get past that limited liability restriction to where you could actually still be held personally liable for things, especially if you don't keep up with filings or you're not treating the business as its own entity, as in you're taking your personal funds or putting your personal funds into the business and just using it like a bank account. If you're not using it or treating it like its own business, because that's what you're saying it is, then in many cases you're increasing the likelihood that you're not going to be able to have that limited liability protection that an LLC, when treated properly, can offer. And if you're unsure about how this would apply to your specific situation, then definitely speak with a licensed attorney who can walk you through the steps and give you actual personalized advice. Although I'm an attorney myself, I am not your attorney. I don't know what your specific situation is, so please go and talk with your own. Anyways, when all goes right, that is the benefit of an LLC. It protects you from the liabilities of the business. That is the limited liability part of a limited liability company. Though that doesn't protect you as a business owner from doing things like fraud or other bad acts, you are still liable for those in your personal capacity, so don't try and skirt around that sort of thing. Anyways, here's my LLC structure. Starting with the first one, which is my holding company for my real estate assets. So this LLC is owned 50-50 between my wife and I. It doesn't really make a big difference since everything flows to the same tax return anyways. That is one advantage of LLCs, is that depending on how you set things up, they can be flow through, which means that there's no taxes at the business level and instead they flow through to your tax return. If you have a single member LLC, you typically can take advantage of that. But to make sure that's the case, do speak with an accountant because the tax code is very complex and sometimes you will have to file a return at the business level and not everything will be flow through. But unfortunately, because we own this 50-50, we do have to file a business level tax return. So that is a bit annoying. I didn't really expect that going in. It's an added expense, but then again, it was going to be an expense on our personal return or on the business side of things because there's a lot of real estate involved in this and real estate has a lot of deductions to work through. But just keep that in mind. Depending on how you do things, you might have to file a business level tax return and then you'll probably get some sort of form that you then include on your personal return. But that said, within this holding company LLC, we actually have another LLC, and that LLC owns the property that's in this portfolio. That'd be the single family home we own out in Indianapolis as a rental. So that is within its own LLC that is within this overarching holding company. So it's an LLC within an LLC. So to be clear, the property level entity is owned 100% by the holding company entity. So I don't actually own the lower level entity in my name. Instead, it is owned by the holding company. So technically there should be a little bit more asset protection there in that if something goes wrong with that individual property, it wouldn't seep over into any future property level entities that we have, again, depending on how the court case went, if it really came down to that. Though ideally wouldn't get to that point if all goes well and we're properly insured, which we would try to be. But as I was kind of saying, in the future, we'd like to have more property level entities, maybe have a few properties within each entity, just kind of separating out the portfolio. Probably by region is how we do this at first, and it really just depends depends on the actual property asset value inside each of these LLCs. Once it got to a certain point, probably would make sense to just separate it out, but it really depends on what you're trying to go for. Each new LLC formed is another layer of compliance. It's more fees, it's more things to worry about, so you gotta keep that in mind. But then again, so is adding another property. Everything is work when it comes down to it. So that's the real estate side of things. I have a holding company and then a property level entity, and then I would look to add more property level entities as I add more properties to the portfolio. Now, on a similar note to the real estate holding company we have, I just formed a new holding company which will be used for the business ventures that I'm trying to do, where I'm trying to acquire a small business. And I'm using a very similar structure. I have a holding company LLC at the very top. Right now there's nothing inside of that LLC because it's brand new. I just started it very recently. But once I acquire a business, I would look to form a new LLC for that business, and then the holding company would 100% own that business level entity. So again, you'd have an LLC within an LLC. And then the third and final bucket, if you want to call it that, would be my media company LLC. That is what would own this YouTube channel, what owns all of my media assets. I am putting them into that LLC and running it as its own business. In the future, if I wanted to use that to acquire some other media business and I wanted to keep that as its own LLC, then I could do the same thing by having an LLC within an LLC once again, but that's not really the goal here, at least from the start. Could happen. The point is, you do have some flexibility when it comes to setting up an LLC and what you're trying to do with it in the future. These things can change. I just look at each LLC like its own sort of compartment, because that's really what it is. It's a shell around whatever you put in it. And in this case, the business is run inside of it, or the businesses I have are run within their respective LLCs. They have their own bank accounts in the LLC's name, not in my personal name, so they are run completely separate from that perspective, even though I am the owner of at least the top level entities myself. Because again, each LLC is its own entity, it's separate from me as a person, and it is treated as its own thing. Now, one extra note I will make is that I do own some rental properties that are still in my name, and I plan on keeping it this way for the foreseeable future because those properties have mortgages on them that are also in my name, and if I were to transfer those properties into an LLC, that would technically trigger what's called the due on sale clause. I don't want to do that. Even though it may not be that likely, it is a risk that I would run by transferring the property. The bank would have that right, if they wanted to, trigger the due on sale clause and force me to actually pay the mortgage in full because I technically sold it to someone else, the someone else being the LLC that I do own. If and when I pay off those debts, that would be the time to transfer them to an LLC because I wouldn't run that risk anymore, and then I could add a layer of asset protection right there. And I could take all of this a step further by introducing trusts and other sorts of things to add more protection to my asset pile, but I don't think it's worth it in my case yet. It might make sense in the future, but I really don't have that massive of a pile of assets or some massive wealth that I'm trying to protect in some way, because there's a lot of compliance costs with that. And if you're spending a huge portion of the portfolio just to maintain the compliance costs of creating this complicated structure, then is it really worth it? You can really make this as complicated as you want it to be. But that's the structure I'm working with now. Things will change in the future, of course, as my businesses change, as I acquire more things and I move them into businesses, or the businesses themselves acquire more things. That's where you're going to see some shifting over the long term. And of course, laws could always change too that make one type of entity structure much more advantageous than another. Right now, I'm using an LLC. Maybe that would change if I want to use something like a corporation or something else. There are benefits and drawbacks to any structure that I would choose. So that's my LLC structure for investing. Like, comment, subscribe, all that great stuff. And until next time, take care.